Okay, good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Thank you very much for making it to this event called Advancing Just Transition Through Innovative Policy Solutions. My name is Judith Carreras, and I work at the Just Transition Institute of Spain. And I'm going to explain you why are we organizing this event and why we invited you here. Well, I mean, I'm not going to develop what happened in Spain in the last years related with just transition. I mean, there is a political commitment. We have developed what we call an institutional anchoring with the creation and setting up of a Just Transition Institute. We're also mobilizing public budget governance. It's been very important with agreements with the trade unions and the companies for the closure of the mines and the coal-fired power plants, and also what we call the Just Transition Agreements on the regions to ensure economic diversification. But today, we are here because we are very much interested to reflect and hear your views on what we define and call innovative public policy solutions. Why that? Because also working at the public administration, we are always thinking, I mean, along these years, we've been trying to be innovative with the elements and the instruments we have available. We've been trying to stretch them as much as possible to be able, I would say, to walk through these uncharted territories, which are very new, I would say, for the role of the public administration. For example, for us, what it's been a very interesting policy that we're putting in place is what we call the Just Transition Tenders. The Just Transition Tenders, it's what we could define an innovative policy solution, because it means that where I would say, with the free capacity that has been liberated with the closure of the coal-fired power plants, this access to grid, before it was assigned through what we call a first-come, first-served basis, of course, provided of fulfillment of technical requirements on renewable production. But we have said, well, we need to rethink that, because this is a very valuable, I would say, aspect, which is creating a lot of interest also among private sectors. So instead of only applying these technological criteria when, I would say, giving access to the grid, we can introduce socioeconomic criteria and make sure that the companies that are granted, I would say, and that are given the permitting to have access to the grid, they are also investing on those territories, I would say, providing jobs, providing, I would say, supporting also the local communities, and that's what we call the Just Transition Tenders, and we say that it's an innovative policy solution because, as I'm saying, we had to stretch quite a bit our tools and figure out how to do that. So I'm not going to extend much more on that, but the reason why we're here is because we really want to learn from different perspectives and different actors, the reflections you're having around that. And so that's the reason why we'll pass the floor to the different speakers, and also I take the occasion to thank you, those people who are following us online. The first speaker is Minister Maisa Rojas. She's the Minister of Environment of the Government of Chile. And yes, and we're very pleased to have you here, Minister, talking on the work you're doing. Yesterday, I had the possibility to be at the high-level dialogue on just transition, on catalyzing financing for just transition. And I think you mentioned something you mentioned many things, but one of them I would say that I found very important. It was this idea also of the nature restoration of the environmental liabilities. We do consider that also very important. And I think that you even mentioned, this is the result of the 22nd century dirty development. And we need to make sure, addressing also these aspects, which for us have been also very core, because we understand there's a lot of well-being related with that, but also I would say the potential even of development of new economic possibilities on those regions. And then also, of course, for us, I would say having you here, it's very important because we have recently signed together a memorandum of understanding, which is very important to work together, I would say, on the aspects of just transition. So please, the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you very much. And okay, I will try to summarize something that I said yesterday and something that I said today as well when we had a meeting in the Canadian pavilion of the Powering Past Coal Alliance, because all these aspects are really so different pieces of the same story. So back in 2019, Chile had 28 coal-fired power plants in 5 territories. 5 territories that had been historically, for the last decades, provided dirty energy and other very dirty industries as well. So all of them are a bit tragically called sacrifice zones in Chile because they have paid a uneven price of the dirty development of the 20th century in the case of Chile. And back then, there was an agreement between the government and the private sector to gradually close them down. That voluntary agreement was the basis for our commitment. Back then, Chile was hosting COP25 to commit to being carbon neutral by 2050. It then became a binding through our climate change law. And up to date, we have closed 9 of them. And I think it is the other way around. We have closed 11 of them, and 9 are ready to be closed in the next 18 months. Now, of course, what we have learned throughout the last years of that transition is that the challenge to have a stable and secure grid energy supply requires a number of other changes that we need to do so that that transition can continue to occur both socially, workers-wise, economically, but also very importantly for having a grid so that we are all sure that we still can turn on the lights. And so for that, the Ministry of Energy, but under the umbrella of our just energy transition and under the umbrella of the climate change law, so in very much close contact with us and other ministries, launched last week for public consultation a decarbonization plan. So, and it has 4 pillars with 45 measures, and I'm just going to read them and to give you a flavor of the challenges that we have. And these are engineering challenges, territorial challenges, social challenges, to be able to do the second part of the transition. So the first line of action or pillar is the urgent development of energy projects for national decarbonization. So we have a lot of solar, but they are far north, and we need basically transmission line and storage systems. The second line is for, it's called electric transmission as enabling for carbon neutrality. And here, aspects that are addressed refer to planning, development, operation, and territorial insertion of transmission system and other key infrastructure. So we have starting to have really serious problems with the urgency and the speed at which we have to get new infrastructure with the territories. People do not want to have more solar, more wind, electricity lines, etc. So this is becoming a very complicated situation. The third line is to have a safe and flexibly short-term operation in a highly renewable electric system. And so these are more sort of engineering-like measures in there. But then also have, and this is the fourth pillar, long-term market sustainability and promotion of clean demand electrification. So this is all the regulatory part that we still require to help this transition to occur as rapidly as possible. Yeah, I think I leave it there. So it's social, it's economic, it's engineering, regulatory, the whole thing. Although the important thing, I think, is that there's a larger consensus. That consensus is translated into a law that helps us to make sure that even though government changes, this transition is going in the correct direction. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now I will pass the microphone. I will give the floor to Raúl Alfaro Pelico. He's Director of Knowledge, Policy and Finance Center in IRENA. And yeah, it's great to have you here. And well, I must say, and I will ask him to develop a bit more. Recently, Spain, together with Sierra Leone, they're co-chairing what is called a collaborative framework on just and inclusive energy transitions, which really shows, I would say, this willingness to address more the social aspects when talking about the just energy transitions. So, yes, the floor is you. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Judith. Good afternoon, everybody. I want to start by first thanking the Spain Pavilion and the Institute of Just Transition of Spain for inviting IRENA to this really important conversation. I really want to underscore that a just and inclusive and equitable energy transition is at the core of our strategy. And so we're really excited to join this conversation together with very distinguished panelists. The second thing, just picking up on your last point, Judith, is what you just mentioned. You know, we have a collaborative framework under the IRENA, which is co-facilitated by Spain and Sierra Leone, which on purpose we're trying to put different countries in different continents with different contexts. We have 170 members at IRENA, and that means there are at least 170 different energy transitions. And so that really calls for more specificity and contextualization of what we mean by that. As you know, we recently launched the first official version of the tracking report for tripling renewables and doubling efficiency. IRENA is the official custodian agency tasked to track those commitments coming out of the UAE consensus. And what is important is that, you know, we talk about tripling and doubling, right? And when we think about where we are, first of all, I think it's important to understand that, you know, we're making significant progress in renewable energy capacity addition. So right now, last year, we added 473 gigawatts of renewable energy. And that's one of the largest increases on a year-by-year basis. That's very impressive. However, when you look at the geographic distribution of that, we find that most of that, those deployments are taking place in G20 countries. And so what happens with the 685 million people that today still don't have access to electricity? What are the solutions for them? So when we try to bring that down, particularly in the current context where countries are navigating just transition challenges, at the same time, they're trying to set up new targets under the third update of the NDCs. I think it's very important that from the very high level already, there is an explicit commitment to address some of the justice, equity, and inclusion aspects. Otherwise, it really doesn't happen. So if I look at the NDCs today, before they are updated, you know, NDCs today have targets that really add up to 5.4 terawatts of renewable energy capacity by 2030. Well, we're trying to get to 11 terawatts. And so one first action before we talk about innovative policies is ensuring that there is really coherence and there isn't an ambition gap between what the NDCs are going to say and where we need to get to. And I think this is where policies and regulations are critical. Oftentimes, NDCs are drafted by a different ministerial department that is not necessarily talking to another department. I'm not going to mention any countries. It's very common, by the way, half of the world at least. And then that's where you see one. Now, when we go from policies and regulations to other enablers of tripling and doubling, we find that there are other areas where we see gaps. For example, skills, capacities, and supply chains. When you look at the NDCs, how many of them talk about those challenges? How many of them talk about investment in skills? As IRENA, you know, we've been tracking renewable energy jobs for the past 10 years. In the last series of the annual review, right now we have estimated that there are 16.2 million jobs in renewable energy that have been added in the past 10 years. Now, in the next 5 to 6 years, we need to get to 30 million. So by 2030, we need to get to 30 million. And that means we need to add around 2 million jobs per year. But at the current rate, we've been adding only 1 million. Now, it's good to pay attention to the number. But you don't add jobs just like that, just by investing. You do need to also look at your education policies, industrial policies, social protection. There is no other way to do that. So it's important to keep track of the number of jobs, and that is important, how many, but it's also important to look at for who. Is it really jobs for the marginalized communities? What are the gender implications of those jobs created? What role youth plays in those? And that's where, in fact, more than policy innovations, we need much more further definition of who those policies are for. Let me touch on the issue of finance. Yesterday was Finance Day, so I guess today we cannot talk about finance. We've fixed that problem. Now, when we talk about just transition, oftentimes the finance conversation is very much focused on the infrastructure, right? But there is a need for finance also for really achieving those targets in education policies, industrial policy. Social protection costs money. Some of the subsidies that some of the mining communities in Chile or other countries in the world need funding. And some of that funding oftentimes is just grants based. The whole conversation about finance is very much, on really the infrastructure, particularly on grid, and particularly those G20 countries. But when we're thinking about, those countries that do not have access to electricity right now, first of all, we need to think about what are the other instruments that would enable some of the challenges that we see in social acceptance. Let me end with one point that I find it's quite critical, that both relates to infrastructure as well as the needed international collaboration. So in infrastructure, we're always thinking about the technical standards of the infrastructure, right? Particularly, we see a significant growth in solar, which is one of the key drivers of renewable energy additions, as well as wind. Now, when we're thinking about the challenges that wind, for example, faces when it comes to land titling, when it comes to permitting, particularly when you're thinking about new capacity, and when as we just heard a few minutes ago, you get into the discussion of social acceptance, where communities are really pushing against additional developments, then we find there are actually technologies that don't need to use more land. So repowering is an example of technologies that allow for extending the useful life of wind turbines. That also means that you don't have to now engage in a new process of social acceptance. And then that is what takes me to this point of the need to think about the different stakeholders that need to be part of this conversation. Governments have this role on policy making, but also that conversation needs to include the private sector from the beginning. They're the ones who know how to get things done, and they're the ones who are demanding clear policies. But then on top of that, we also need to really bring it down to communities, civil society organizations, indigenous peoples, because those ones, if they're not engaged from the beginning, then they're going to be the first barrier for a just transition. Let me leave it there.
Thank you very much, Raul. Now I'm passing the floor to Nick Robbins, Professor in Practice for Sustainable Finance within the Graham Research Institute at the London Schools of Economic and Political Science. Yesterday, those also that were a high-level dialogue on catalyzing finance and just transition, we had the possibility, I would say, to have a lot of food for thought with your presentation. So we're very much keen, I would say, to listen, your contributions, addressing more, I would say, this finance aspect and this fiscal dimension, related with policy in innovation. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, and it's a great pleasure to be at the Spain Pavilion, I think for the second time. And it's a very warm place, and it's great to be here with so many of the people who I've admired and looked at. So the minister in Chile, the program in Spain, the work of Irina, and of course the leadership of the European Union on just transition. So I'm here to listen and learn like any good researcher. So just a bit about what we do at the LSE. We've set up a very new lab, a Just Transition Finance Lab. And that is really trying to look primarily at the role of the private sector, as you were saying, Raul, in the just transition. We are also looking at policy innovation, I'll come to that, but our primary focus is on the role of banks, of investors, pension funds, capital markets, the bond market, and so on, and to identify the role they can play, because this is the area which is going to provide the most amount of finance for business, but also for households and communities. So that's our primary focus. And we recognize that if we are going to make the just transition real, we are going to have to think about often transforming the way that the financial sector operates. Because so often the way that the sort of private financial sector has looked at climate action, there has been a blindness to the human and social dimension, and this has not been a normal aspect. So our focus is primarily on the, let's say, the 80% of transition finance and how that can be a supporter of just transition, and what policy mechanisms are needed to do that. One of the things clearly I think here at COP and beyond is we need to bring together the separate discussions of Just Transition Work Programme, where money is not really mentioned, and the NCQG, where Just Transition is often not mentioned. So actually, how can we make sure that those two things are actually connected? One of the things that comes up when we talk to investors and the private sector and so on is that if we want a just transition, it's going to cost more. The norm is maybe an unjust transition, or not very nice transition, or inadequate transition, or a sort of missed opportunity transition. So if we want to actually have a just transition, it's going to cost more. And who pays? Who pays? And primarily to date, it has been domestic governments who've paid for that, whether that's in Chile or in Spain or the European Union or in the US or in my country. And of course the question then is who pays internationally and how do we incorporate that into development finance? And also therefore what is the role of the private sector where their incentive all the time is to deliver transition at least cost. So there's in a sense a tension often between just transition and the market incentives which drive down cost. So that's one of the challenges we're trying to deliver, is to show why it is important for private sector operators, banks, pension funds, businesses to take action on just transition and how they can allocate capital for that. So that's just an introduction. And on the sort of way we look at just transition, it's very much based on the ILO guidelines. So I think primarily thinking about maximizing the social and economic opportunities of the transition. This is something that can be shaped to deal with poverty and inequality, entrenched injustices, obviously deal with some of the sort of negative impacts, the job losses we see in high carbon sectors, and then I think as Raoul was saying, clearly making sure that this has to be designed by stakeholders and communities from the bottom up. So we're talking about innovative policy instruments, and I'll mention a few, but I'll also point to other speakers. So clearly we have in the EU, we have a number of mechanisms, and I'll leave to Frank to talk about that, just transition mechanisms and so on, the social climate fund. I think probably one of the more exciting is one I hope is going to be sustained, is the US Inflation Reduction Act, which has been a remarkable policy instrument, lots of domestic fiscal money to actually require companies to have community benefit plans and then to provide extra financing, particularly for disadvantaged communities and those with strong labor rights. Clearly there is a international just transition element because it's seen as being very protectionist. So there's an element. I was going to talk about the just transition tenders. We're actually in the process of writing a case study on the just transition tenders, which in Spain is a very interesting mechanism whereby, again, as you were saying, it's not fiscal money, but essentially you are channeling public money into social development of post-coal regions and using access to grid as a lever for that. So I think we can talk about that later. We're in the Spanish pavilion, so maybe someone from Spain to talk about that. Yesterday I talked about an example from Chile, so it's very good to have the minister here again with us. This was a private sector instrument, a bond that the company Engie had issued, $400 million to support its transition from coal to renewables, and it had three key performance indicators on phasing out coal, increasing renewables, and then actually increasing the rate of women in management, and it was linked to stakeholder involvement and so on. So the question there we're asking is, are there mechanisms such as particular types of loans or particular types of bonds where the interest rate is linked to just transition outcomes. I think this is probably going to be one of the next areas for innovation where companies would get lower interest rates potentially for just transition outcomes. I want to touch on 2-3 more examples. The second then is internationally we have the Just Energy Transition Partnerships signed with South Africa, with Indonesia, Vietnam and Senegal. We're speaking a lot with South Africa. This has been a process going on for 3 years. I think what is really interesting, certainly talking from the 2 earlier examples, South Africa and Indonesia, is although they have a big J at the beginning, Just Energy Transition Partnership, there is very little J in justice in these programs. Really small, probably less than 1 or 2%. So I think again it's about how international partners, when working with countries, major countries such as South Africa and Indonesia, properly recognize and fund the just transition, which is, as we know, is largely going to have to be grant financed. And that funding to date, and I think if we're looking around international finance for climate, the funding for just transition is really too small. One final area, again, we're very new, so we're doing these new case studies, is an example looking at transition credits in ASEAN, where you use the carbon market to phase down coal power plants early. And again, there's a mechanism that's been developed with a Philippines power producer called ASEN, where again, as part of this, you would have allocations of private capital if the credit went ahead to just transition. Again, quite a small proportion of the overall money, about 1 or 2%. So it's I suppose, is that a good thing or a bad thing? Is 1 or 2% the right number, or is it actually too small in terms of allocations to just transition? And then finally, if I may, I'm going to repeat something I said here at my last session, which is maybe not a financing mechanism, but is a financial regulation mechanism, which is the idea of transition plans. We're now increasingly across the world, in the European Union, in the UK, in other parts of the world, is now recognized that companies and financial institutions need to adopt, either voluntarily or by law, transition plans saying how they're going to get to net zero. The targets, the capex, and so on. And there's now, I think, a growing agreement that within these transition plans you need to have just transition elements. And this is where I think you could start looking at the spending, getting commitments from companies to say the spending that they're going to deliver for the development of their workforce, for community development, for supply chains and so on. So it's not a direct funding mechanism, but a financial regulation which actually would, I think, sort of start to force companies or require companies to consider how they're going to deliver just transition and report on that and disclose on that. So it could then lead to innovative financing.
Thank you very much, Nick. As mentioned, you've given a lot of food for thought and many examples, and we really see actually here also the value and the importance of the work you're doing on financing and on sustainable finance. We say, last but not least, we have with us Frank Siebert-Thomas, Head of Unit at the European Commission dealing with green and digital transformations research. And I think, it's very important also because you are part of this gray, I would say, production and material, to really analyze and be forward-looking, I would say, on the type of policies and that the Commission can take next and look what it's working, and as I'm saying, having this forward-looking vision. So we're very happy to have you here, and please, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Judith. Thank you very much to Spain for the invitation to this pavilion, and thank you for all the dynamism with which you also guide, let's say, the EU policy agenda in this field, I guess, which is fair to say. I would just I can echo a lot of things which were said and will probably not repeat those, just to say that obviously the European Commission and the European Union has taken the commitment for a just transition since the launch of the Green Deal in 2019. And this has been reaffirmed, so we must ensure that these transitions are inclusive. They will not be so by default. And we have to, let's say, the transition has to be just, or there will just be no transition. That's also the guiding line for our policy action in this field. This importance of the just transition has been reconfirmed during the recent crisis to which we have been living, and that the rollout of renewables, etc., the support to the transition has been accelerated through those crises as also a means to address the crisis. And it was reaffirmed in the new political guidelines of the new Commission. Maybe one first innovative idea, and this did happen because stakeholders had asked for it. The new Commission will have a Commissioner for Just Transition. So Mrs. Ribera has been nominated Executive Vice President for a clean, just and competitive transition. She will be in charge of ensuring that Europe's transition is for the benefit of people and their jobs, helping to boost our economy and industry and ensuring no one is left behind. And she will be steering our investment and financing in a just and social transition, notably through the Social Climate Fund and Just Transition Fund. Next to her is an Executive Vice President for People and Skills, Mrs. Mințatu from Romania, and she, for example, in her mission letter has reference to designing what's called a quality jobs roadmap. It was mentioned before, this highlights the importance we have to give to quality, the quality of the new jobs during the transition and also in the green economy of tomorrow. To support this, we are trying to put in place at European level at what we want to call the Just Transition Policy Framework. This has many tools. It has legislation, financial support through the funds mentioned, political guidance to member states, tools also to improve the evidence bases and research in the field, and last but not least, the tools to involve all stakeholders, real whole of society approach. And this, let's say, having this in place in itself is probably an innovation. What we have done in particular is we have negotiated with member states a recommendation on ensuring fair transition. This is policy guidance, it's legally non-binding, but we are following it up with the member states on a regular level through peer reviews. And this recommendation, let's say, I think echoes what was said before, that member states need to put in place comprehensive policy packages from the start and integrate socioeconomic impact from the start, not as an afterthought in the process, to create quality jobs, promote reskilling and income support through the transition, including not only in phasing out sectors, but in sectors under restructuring, and also towards the new sectors of the economy, circular economy and others. They may have to adapt social protection systems and ensure access to essential services for all. All of this with a meaningful full involvement of social partners, civil society organizations and citizens as a whole. Now we have held a first round of peer reviews from member states. Where do you stand in the implementation of these recommendations? And there was key messages adopted by Labour ministers in November 23 on this, and it shows that also areas where further innovation is needed, I think, to be fair. With a notable exception of Spain, which was singled out in these key messages, it stated that no other EU member state has a comprehensive just transition strategy in place. And it's also mentioned overall that there's scope for a more coordinated, systematic and targeted approach, which was mentioned before. Coordination here is a key challenge, both for analysis but also for policy making. And last but not least, it has, let's say, highlighted areas where we need to improve, including on simple things as creating evidence, how to measure, how to conceptualize green jobs, how to measure transport poverty and other elements which we need to follow up in this context. To be fair, there have been a lot of requests by stakeholders how this framework can be improved. A lot of work has been done under the Spanish and Belgian Council presidencies at the EU level. The European Parliament had this resolution, the Economic and Social Committees, Committee of the Regions, and other stakeholders have, let's say, made calls for new ideas here. I already mentioned one, and they also refer often to the idea of just transition plans. That it's probably the picture is not quite clear, but the point is made to what extent we can go beyond just transition plans at the regional level and instill them at other levels, be they company, sectoral, value chain related ones, whatever is relevant for the transition. I would like to finalize by maybe indicating briefly a few innovative ideas or approaches and tools we are developing. First, let me start with the evidence-related one in relation to implementing this council recommendation in our work. We are setting out to set up a tool which we want to call European Fair Transition Observatory. It will be a tool, a one-stop shop, publicly accessible also to stakeholders to guide the public debate and inform it with more granular information, sectoral and other regional, on fair transition policies in place, best practices, and also data on impacts. We think this is needed to have an open debate on this. We cannot rely only on long-term impact assessments showing that after 30 years everything will be fine. People want to know now where the benefits and costs and risks are in the transition. And I heard yesterday a lot, I'm a COP novice, I have to admit, but I heard a lot references to the words transparency and accountability, for example. I think tools like this, even if they are technical and may help to do this. countries. I would like to highlight quickly the Social Climate Fund, which was mentioned, which is a new tool being put in place by the two commissioners I just mentioned before. And Commissioner Hoekstra, who's also here, obviously in charge. And this is to help vulnerable households, vulnerable transport users and vulnerable micro-enterprises to address higher energy and transport costs following the introduction of a new emission trading scheme for housing and road transport, which does have price implications, but those are being factored in. Such a tool is being set up, and member states will have to identify the vulnerable groups. I want to mention this as innovative for various reasons, because it's a fund which combines structural investments in energy efficiency, low emission mobility with direct income support. It's a fund which highlights the need to have consistency between these two measures over time, so it builds on the transition element. And it's also probably innovative in the sense that it front-loads support. Support starts 1 year before the new scheme is expected to, so there's a clear message also to the public that there's awareness of the need to support. And last but not least, it puts in place a partnership principle, it consults everyone, and it requires coordination across all departments. And last but not least, on the policy side, maybe just to drop 3 words, transformation in the sector's value chains under restructuring is important. There are probably a couple of good ideas which are identified in our exchanges from Germany, Austria, some other countries which have put in place regional transformation councils to help workers and counsel them throughout the transition, to reskilling, upskilling during the transition for new sectors. In Austria, the Chamber of Labor in particular has put in place a so-called Worker Academy for socio-ecological transition. It trains more than hundreds, if not thousands, of workers on this to share also awareness of the benefits this transition can have, and the empowering workers in the process. And last but not least, probably I would here to refer to in Germany, the attempt to put in place climate protection agreements, as they call it, or carbon contracts for difference, which helps startup financing of companies for innovative, cost-efficient solutions in clean tech manufacturing and others, which then they would be paid back in parts once these technologies are cheaper. There are probably many other innovative solutions we put in place, but you have more on the panels. I'm happy to listen.
Thank you very much, Frank. And let me also apologize, because I used to know your unit at F3, and that's the problem, that I don't know the full name. So let me say that it's Fair, Green and Digital Transformations Research at the European Commission. That's the problem when you learn certain acronyms, that then you don't recall the full name. Well, it's been very, very easy to moderate this panel because you've been very disciplined. So thank you for that. And also putting on the table a lot of, I would say, elements and reflections, which are very interesting. But I don't want to keep the microphone on. I want to pass the floor to the audience in case there's any specific question in these last few minutes we have ahead of us.
So, thank you very much. This extremely interesting panel. I would like to perhaps ask you to share examples of good practices that we could take forward in Spain. I know we are a leader in just transition, but I know Judith has a great role in the development of the update of the just transition strategy, and we were discussing informally about how just transition initiatives and just transition governance is mainly thought to help the phase out of fossil fuels, but they're not really thought out for the phasing of renewables. And we have an 81% target of renewable in the power system in Spain by 2030, and in order to bring the citizens along and reduce social backlash, it would be fantastic to think about and know about experiences in governing this phasing of renewables within a just transition framework. Thank you so much.
Is there any other questions? Yes, here.
Hi. Yes, I also want to ask a question which actually was discussed yesterday with people that were also from outside Europe, which is the opportunity of also linking in not just transition but just adaptation. because we now need to do both at the same time.
I'm not sure about the other. Maybe I will follow the same order we had as interventions.
Yeah, very, very quickly, because I didn't really mention this in my first intervention, but because in the case of Chile, we are prioritizing the just transition in these territories where we have coal-fired power plants, and these are 5, so it's kind of it's almost like a pilot, not so small, not too big, that we can sort of address. We have asked those communities to do their own plans, really, of transitioning, because the question is what they want to be after those coal-fired power plants are closed. Do they want to have a different economic development? Do they want to go back to what they were doing before, which was like fishery or tourism? Do they want to continue to be in industrialized communities? And for that, we have worked on with the communities, and in one of them in particular, we also included not only young people, but even children, so that they could help us to, imagine basically how do they see themselves, in 5 years and 10 years and sort of in the long term. Where do they want their own development to go? And I guess the idea behind that is, of course, to get the social acceptance, right? And the other thing is that for a long time, this work was only in the Ministry of Environment. And of course, there's no way we can do all of this if it's just one ministry. So we have set up a committee as well with 8 different ministries. There's education, there's the woman, health, etc., so that we can really make sure that all the intersectional work and measures are going to be able to be implemented, followed, monitored, etc. So I guess, okay. And the last part, which is of course the money part, we are working on that. Our strategy is in public consultation at the moment, and that's sort of the last bit that we really need to put together, probably in a law, so that we can make sure that this is maintained in the future.
Thank you, everyone, for these productive discussions. So, Mr. Robbins highlighted, let's say, Inflation Reduction Act as one of the, let's say, effective tool for addressing this just transition. But in other part of ocean, this initiative triggered some concerns as to the loss of jobs or outflow of credits, capitals, which also, by one hand, it creates new jobs in one part of the world, in another part of the world it causes loss of jobs. So what are you seeing, if there should be any global umbrella for tackling this just transition, so that all the initiatives taken in national level will not, let's say, further complicate the situation in other part of the world? Thank you.
Thank you very much. As we have also 5 minutes to finish the event, what I'll do is, if you don't mind, maybe like on the 3 questions we had to have also a final minute. And I don't know if the minister wants to add something else, because I know she needs to run already to the next event. So I don't know if you have a final word for us.
Yeah, just a final word. I think it is absolutely clear that there will be no transition if it's not just. And if we want social acceptance for this transition to occur, and to occur at the speed that they need to occur, I think this should be a very strong message to all of the financial sector that they have to include this, because otherwise it's just not going to be implementable. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Following the same order, Raúl, do you? Yeah.
Thank you. I think maybe to this question on regional disparity, I think one key solution is to look at things from if we go into a particular country or a region, to take a community engagement approach. Why I mention that is because oftentimes when we're thinking about just transition and maybe touching on the question of phase out and phase in, it's hardly ever like for like. So if you are a coal miner, you may not necessarily become a solar PV installer, and you don't actually have to. Because if you look at the wider economy, what renewables-based energy transition can bring is different type of jobs, different economic activities where you as an individual or your community can play a different role, but you still have a role to play. And I think this is where it's critical to look at, what are the, not just the direct jobs, and we keep track of those, but it's also to look at the indirect jobs that come with the energy transition, particularly a renewables-based energy transition, which needs more human capital compared to a fossil fuels-based economy. And then also look at the induced jobs. And if I take that outside of a country and I look at different countries around the world, one of the key enablers that we have highlighted in our tracking report is supply chains. There is nothing that can happen without developments in other parts of the world. And so I think this is an opportunity for countries to define, based on their comparative advantage, what role can they play in that supply chain.
Nick?
Yes, thanks for the questions. So the first one was about actually just transition on the sort of phase in of renewables. And I think that's, we are seeing some examples in terms of particular policy regimes, particularly, and this is something maybe which hasn't come in, thinking about actually how do you involve and actually how communities get real benefit from the programs more than just sort of voluntary charity programs. So I think that's one area. And again, how do you get the private investment community to properly incorporate just transition principles? But I think the questions that we've had have also highlighted this is not just something for energy. We discussed buildings, it's transport, if you look what's happening at the EV sector, agriculture, forestry and so on, and adaptation as well. And that's certainly the context here at COP, is that just transition is applied both for mitigation and adaptation. One of the things I think is interesting to explore is to what extent actually can the mitigation just transition learn from the adaptation, because adaptation from the beginning has been about people, actually. And so there may be approaches, particularly at the local level. So in a sense, there may already be areas there. And then finally, the question about the Inflation Reduction Act. This is important. We produced a report yesterday called Interconnected Justice, and particularly looking about what are the implications of one country's just transition on another. And the Inflation Reduction, I think, is one of those. It was deliberately interested in America's interests through a just transition focus. So I think there is a need for a forum to think about these mechanisms. UNFCCC is one, but also maybe ILO, WTO, and so on. Really to think about that we actually want countries to do just transition, but not to have negative impacts on other countries. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Frank, your minute.
Yes, on this last point, we already mentioned, no problem. Thank you very much. The Just Transition work program, the ongoing negotiations on this. So progress in the areas mentioned, Just Transition work program, plus the uptake of Just Transition aspects in the NDCs, for example, like we try to do in the National Energy and Climate Plans in Europe, can probably address some of these issues and bring them to the fore and show how combined ambitions, let's say, can lead to joint actions instead of actions one against the other, because the target we're following is the same here, to reach climate neutrality sooner or later in our different countries, but with let's say joint strategies we probably can go fast. In one of the sessions I attended, there was a quote saying from an African participant that they would have a saying, if you want to go fast, go alone. If you want to go far, go together. So maybe we want to go far here in this. We have to go fast as we can, but we want to go far above all. On adaptation, I do agree, in particular on the European strategy. It covers both mitigation and adaptation. I think I would agree to what Nick said here. And the last one, best practices. Maybe I can share a bit. There are probably some countries which have gone faster in the rollout of renewables and which have also more ambitious targets to reach 100%. So maybe those can be good examples. Some of the Nordic countries in the EU, for example. We also have examples from the research angle. In particular, there's a so-called mission on cities to help up some 100 cities in the European Union to become climate neutral by 2030. Now, all those cities test out something. They test out multi-level governance systems. They test out solutions. One would hope that they come back with ideas and with solutions that have worked at the city and local level that can be scaled up to regional and other levels. So happy to share that. And last but not least, one other reference, because Judith referred to our full unit title, which also includes research. There's a lot of research going on into technology solutions which will be needed to drive that transition. There's some, the Commission will pilot as of next year a kind of societal readiness index or societal readiness indicators of these transitions, because those two have to go together. Technologies we develop, including green technologies, also have to take this into account, uptake at the workplace and uptake in society.
Thank you very much. As there's been a specific question to Spain, allow me maybe to refer to it and mention that in the climate law in Spain, it says that every 5 years we need to adopt a just transition strategy. So there is an understanding, that this is a live process, an ongoing one. And in a way also, as Minister Rojas was saying, in Spain also we have like the 50 just transition areas which are related with the places where we had the coal-fired. In a way, they're like sort of pilots, and now, of course, we need to reflect on what it means, knowing that the energy just transition is at the backbone of the transitions, but that has implications, the decarbonization of the economy in different sectors, So this type, I would say, of encounters and reflecting together, it's fundamental, because it can really, I would say, give us elements when we go back home, on see the next steps that need to be taken. So in that sense, thank you very much to those that came, that connected, and please give a round of applause to our speakers.